Welcome to the Audiobook Vault. Today, our book is about the cold, unseen architecture of behavioral dominance and the systematic neuropsychological strategies required to build an absolute, unshakable, silent authority without ever needing to raise your vocal pitch. For generations, the social conditioning of the collective matrix has fed you the toxic illusion that power is defined by verbal noise, high-volume rhetoric, and the frantic necessity to assert your presence through continuous, aggressive speech. Let us be clinical and completely honest with each other from the very first seconds of this elite audio transmission. This foundational conditioning is a profound operational falsehood designed to keep your energetic circuits in a state of permanent exhaustion. The frantic urge to shout, over-explain, and aggressively dominate the auditory timeline of a room is not a demonstration of genuine authority. It is an explicit, subconscious betrayal of deep-seated internal panic and severe emotional vulnerability. It is a primitive, defensive biological distress flare broadcasting to the entire environment that your system is actively begging for validation and is deeply terrified of being ignored or overlooked by the surrounding network. During the next few minutes, a definitive psychological firewall will be built inside your conscious mainframe, and you will permanently cease to be the porous, reactive individual who squanders their premium life equity trying to verbalize their worth to a distracted room. You will learn to step across the threshold of any high-stakes professional arena, executive boardroom, or hostile negotiation suite not as a chaotic petitioner begging for attention, but as a heavy, unmoving gravity well, a silent, absolute sovereign frequency that forces every volatile actor in the environment to automatically lower their volume, constrict their spatial movements, and submissively realign their behavioral parameters to match the unhurried pacing of your master frame. Have you ever paused to analyze why the vast majority of professionals and ambitious managers spend their days burning immense physical calories in a desperate effort to please their superiors, dictate meetings, and enforce their opinions through loud verbal confrontations, only to find themselves continuously marginalized, passed over for strategic promotions, and treated with cold institutional indifference by the true power centers of the enterprise? Have you ever wondered how an elite minority of senior operators can enter the exact same corporate landscape, sit in absolute, unblinking silence for 90% of a high-stakes transaction, and yet command such a terrifying degree of raw, nonverbal authority that their briefest, low-velocity declarations carry the absolute weight of a finalized judicial ruling? This systemic divergence does not exist because those elite actors possess a genetically inherited charisma or an esoteric social talent that you were denied at birth. It exists because they have completely mastered a hidden, highly insulated behavioral discipline that 99% of the human collective remains entirely blind to. They have learned the supreme law of the reactive entity and the clinical weaponization of strategic silence. They have discovered that in the cold theater of human organization, the individual who talks the most is the individual who is actively leaking the most premium data, revealing their strategic vulnerabilities, and handing the keys of their psychological perimeter directly to their opponents. When you over-explain your positions or raise your vocal pitch to counter an objection, you are submissively validating the counterparty's leverage, confirming to their subconscious mind that their environmental pressure has successfully altered your chemical baseline and forced you into a state of defensive compliance with their conflict narrative. To break free from this functional vulnerability, you must install the behavioral protocol of absolute kinetic and expressive deceleration. The unvetted individual moves through the professional landscape with hyperactive body language, frequent head nods, rapid hand gestures, high-velocity blinking patterns, and erratic shifting of their physical weight. This continuous physical motion is a catastrophic systemic failure. It drains your neural processing bandwidth and communicates a state of severe biological emergency to the mirror neurons of everyone in your orbit, instantly lowering your social scale and inviting aggressive counterplays from your competitors. The sovereign builder establishes authority by enforcing total, clinical economy of movement. When an aggressive colleague interrupts you, or a hostile client attempts to apply sudden psychological pressure, you execute an immediate, total freeze of your physical vessel. Your facial matrix remains a smooth, unreadable mask. Your shoulders remain broad, dropped, and heavy, and your hands remain locked into positions of absolute spatial weight. You do not offer the submissive micro-nods of polite social agreement that the collective uses to validate their peers. You lock your eyes onto their upper facial triangle with a frozen analytical focus that transforms your gaze into an impenetrable mirror. By refusing to mirror their chaotic velocity, you create a profound energetic vacuum in the room, forcing the attacker's nervous system to experience immediate destabilizing cognitive friction as their emotional waves crash helplessly against your unyielding, stone-cold monolith, leaving you in absolute possession of the strategic high ground. Take a deep, controlled breath. Purge the old conditioning of verbal desperation from your servers and prepare to absorb the raw, unvarnished mechanics of the silent legislative frame. To advance into the second layer of silent authority, you must master the calculated execution of conversational gap engineering and the tactical deployment of strategic non-responsiveness within the professional arena. The average business communicator suffers from a profound psychological horror of conversational silence. When an unexpected pause occurs during an important executive meeting or a high-stakes contract negotiation, the unvetted individual experiences an immediate, automated surge of internal social anxiety. Their subconscious mind perceives the interprets the emptiness as a sign of interpersonal friction or personal failure, driving them to frantically fill the void by introducing unplanned explanatory sentences, revealing hidden financial compromises, or offering premature verbal concessions just to lower the emotional tension in the room. This frantic hyperactivity is an operational disaster that institutional master networks actively look for and exploit with surgical precision. The sovereign views an unexpected silence not as an administrative emergency to be fixed, but as a high-velocity tactical vacuum, an intense psychological arena where the entity with the most disciplined, insulated nervous system can effortlessly shatter the defense mechanisms of their opponents and seize absolute control of the interaction timeline without expending a single calorie of vocal energy. This tactical containment requires the clinical implementation of the deliberate conversational bridge delay. When an adversary or a senior stakeholder delivers a complex proposal, an aggressive ultimatum, or a highly provocative technical question, the natural defensive instinct is to react instantly, firing back an immediate verbal defense to validate your position before they can control the narrative. The sovereign completely bypasses this reactive reflex. When the counterparty finishes their transmission, you do not rush to answer. You intentionally freeze your vocal mainframe and introduce a heavy, unyielding pause of 4 to 6 seconds before you allow your first word to cross your lips. During this calculated delay, you do not look down at your notes or shift your posture. You maintain absolute, unblinking eye contact with their facial matrix, breathing with deep, rhythmic stability. This extended pause acts as a massive psychological shockwave to the opponent's internal network because their primitive brain is pre-programmed to expect immediate verbal feedback. Your absolute stillness forces their mind into a high-intensity feedback loop of self-doubt. They begin to frantically question if their statement was illogical, if their numbers are inaccurate, or if you possess an unlit informational advantage that completely neutralizes their strategy, forcing them to over-explain their premise and compromise their original leverage. Furthermore, we must dissect the supreme law of semantic deflation and minimalist vocal inflection. When you choose to break your strategic silence and deliver your verbal counterstrike, you must completely strip your voice of the high-pitched, fast-paced, and upward-inflected tones that the collective uses to plead for social validation. You deliver your words at a heavily decelerated velocity, lowering your volume to a quiet, concentrated, and intensely focused frequency that forces the entire room to cease all peripheral movement just to capture your transmission. You do not use complex academic vocabulary or emotional adjectives to justify your worth. You use short, clinical, and absolute declarations that isolate the raw structural parameter of the situation. You utilize precise, downward-inflected phrases like, "Your current operational layout does not align with our baseline requirements," or "Let us look directly at the structural limitation of this contract." By delivering these minimalist sentences with absolute emotional neutrality, you communicate to the environment that the opponent's rhetorical theatricality has had zero impact on your internal citadel, triggering an immediate surge of cortisol within their system that forces them to abandon their offensive posture and submissively realign their behavior within your legislative frame. This conversational dominance prepares you for the clinical execution of the frozen nonverbal refusal matrix. In high-pressure corporate dynamics, aggressive rival actors will frequently attempt to test your boundaries by tossing out casual disrespect, unvetted interruptions, or borderline unprofessional comments disguised as casual humor, expecting you to either offer a submissive laugh to maintain social politeness or engage in a high-energy verbal argument that lowers your authority. The sovereign neutralizes these microaggressions through absolute, unmoving non-responsiveness. When the provoking comment is delivered, you do not smile, you do not frown, and you completely refuse to offer the auditory cue of a verbal reply. You simply stop what you are doing, turn your physical vessel slowly toward the aggressor, and look at them with a flat, clinical, and unblinking gaze for 3 long seconds of absolute silence before calmly turning your head back to your original work as if they do not exist. This radical, cold exclusion signals to the entire room that their aggressive input is completely beneath your processing bandwidth, stripping them of their perceived status, inducing immediate social panic within their internal network, and establishing your silent authority as an unhackable, unyielding reality that cannot be crossed. By integrating these advanced conversational gap subroutines within the second layer of your invisible influence blueprint, you have elevated your presence from a standard participant to an elite psychological anchor within the marketplace. You no longer walk into meetings hoping that the conversation goes smoothly or that people treat you with unearned respect. You actively master the hidden architecture of silence, tension, and non-reactivity to build a heavy gravitational field that automatically commands the room. The old software of retail conversational desperation, conversational filler sentences, and submissive politeness has been permanently purged from your operational system, leaving you standing at the absolute center of your professional landscape as an unyielding, stone-cold master of silent legislative authority and invisible network control.
To advance into the third layer of silent authority, you must master the structural engineering of geographic territory and the tactical deployment of high-density spatial mechanics within the physical workspace. The average professional steps into an executive boardroom, a corporate conference hall, or a high-stakes negotiation.
Suite with absolute behavioral blindness toward the physical geography of the environment. They submissively allow the natural flow of the room or the casual directions of lower status actors to dictate where they sit, how much physical space they occupy, and how they arrange their immediate professional materials. They contract their physical vessel, fold their arms across their chest, pull their knees tightly together, and position their devices in protective, defensive configurations that communicate an immediate state of submissive displacement to the mirror neurons of everyone in the room. This frantic spatial minimization is a profound operational failure. It broadcasts a clear biological signal that your system is experiencing high-intensity internal pressure and does not feel entitled to dominate the immediate territory. The sovereign analyzes the physical geometry of a workspace with the cold, calculating eye of a military architect, viewing every chair, every table line, and every spatial gap not as neutral furniture, but as high-leverage strategic territory designed to be systematically occupied and controlled. This spatial domination requires the immediate implementation of the geometric anchorage and posture widening protocol. The moment you cross the threshold of a strategic room, you do not rush to seat yourself or check your digital notifications to mask your social discomfort. You move with an unhurried, decelerated physical velocity that instantly signals absolute environmental ownership. When you select your seat, you deliberately choose a position of maximum visual leverage, preferably a central commanding location that forces the rest of the room to rotate their bodies and adjust their focal vectors just to face your perimeter. When you settle into your seat, you completely eliminate the submissive micro-adjustments of posture that the collective uses to look busy. You open your posture wide, allowing your back to sink into the center of the chair with relaxed, unshakable confidence, and you drop your shoulders completely to eliminate the muscle tension that betrays an accelerated nervous system. You anchor your elbows firmly onto the armrests or the boardroom table, occupying your full geometric territory with purposeful weight. By expanding your physical vessel and maintaining a state of profound, relaxed stillness, you project a high-density sovereign frequency that cuts through the erratic, hyperactive movements of your rivals, automatically forcing the human environment to perceive your frame as the primary anchor of stability in the space. Furthermore, we must dissect the supreme law of spatial artifact deployment and territorial boundary expansion. The fragile retail mind treats their personal belongings, their premium smartphones, leather notebooks, executive pens, and luxury watches as mere utilitarian tools to be kept hidden, tightly consolidated, or held close to their chest in a submissive, defensive clench. The predatory operator treats their material artifacts as high-leverage boundary markers designed to expand their private perimeter deep into the shared territory of the meeting room. When you sit at the table, you do not crowd your items near your body. You calmly and deliberately deploy them outward, placing your notebook, your smart device, and your materials at the absolute outer boundaries of your available desk space. This calculated expansion of your physical footprint acts as a non-verbal declaration of territorial sovereignty that the primitive limbic system of your rivals cannot ignore. When a competitor looks across the table, they do not just see your face, they see an expansive, organized, and unyielding barrier of physical items that commands their visual field. If an opponent attempts to place their materials inside your expanded perimeter, you do not move your items back in a submissive retreat. You maintain your boundary with an unblinking, cold focus,
forcing their subconscious to realize that your territory is an unhackable, sovereign zone that cannot be crossed. This geometric mastery prepares you for the clinical execution of the decelerated visual scanning matrix. In the intense theater of corporate leadership, when multiple actors are debating an issue or raising their vocal volume to capture the group's attention, the unvetted individual frantically darts their eyes from speaker to speaker, tracking the verbal noise like a spectator at a tennis match. This rapid eye tracking is a catastrophic behavioral leak. It demonstrates to the environment that your mind is hyper-reactive, easily manipulated by sound, and dependent on the inputs of others to coordinate its focus. The sovereign practices radical ocular deceleration. When someone speaks, you do not violently snap your head toward them. You allow a deliberate 2-second delay to hang in the air before you slowly rotate your head and fix your gaze upon their facial matrix. If they deliver their statement with chaotic, high-frequency emotional noise, you do not blink or offer validating head nods. You simply absorb their data through a cold, unmoving lens of analytical detachment before slowly shifting your gaze horizontally toward the next strategic variable on the board. By commanding the velocity of your own eyes, you communicate an absolute internal security that forces the entire network to surrender their strategic autonomy to your silent, dominant frequency. By integrating these advanced spatial engineering subroutines within the third layer of your invisible influence blueprint, you have permanently left behind the submissive behavioral software of the retail collective. You have transformed your physical vessel into an elite, heavy gravitational mass that dictates the physical and psychological coordinates of the professional landscape. You no longer walk into meetings hoping to find a comfortable space to exist. You step across the threshold to hunt down, isolate, and monopolize the primary territorial flows of the boardroom matrix, forcing every rival actor to submissively adjust their posture, lower their volume, and realign their frame to fit within the unyielding parameters of your silent empire. To advance into the fourth layer of silent authority, you must master the sophisticated mechanics of magnetic conversational guidance and the tactical implantation of strategic concepts within the minds of your counterparties through directed, silent inquiry. The average business communicator operates under the naive delusion that to persuade an audience or direct a corporate board, they must continuously speak, projecting a massive torrent of arguments, data points, and verbal justifications in a desperate bid to overwhelm the resistance of the room. This hyperverbal approach is a critical strategic blunder that triggers immediate psychological resistance within your listeners. It makes your ideas feel invasive, aggressive, and foreign, driving the counterparty to activate their defensive filters and look for logical flaws within your narrative just to preserve their intellectual autonomy. The sovereign completely rejects this high-energy verbal warfare. You understand that true, unhackable influence is never achieved by forcing an opinion down an opponent's throat. It is achieved by masterfully creating a pre-calculated conversational labyrinth where the counterparty is gently, silently guided to discover your strategic conclusion on their own, mistakenly believing it was a product of their own unique intellect. This magnetic guidance requires the immediate implementation of the diagnostic investigative frame and the removal of the declarative stance. The unvetted individual enters a disagreement by making loud, absolute declarations like, "Your current logistics plan is inefficient and will fail next quarter," which instantly locks the opponent into a bitter defensive posture to protect their professional status. The sovereign completely eliminates these confrontational declarations from their linguistic server. When you identify a severe operational bottleneck or a flawed assumption in a partner's strategy, you deliver your counterstrike using short, low-velocity, and intensely focused diagnostic questions that contain embedded strategic parameters. You use calm, downward-inflected inquiries like, What specific liquidity cushions have you installed to absorb a 40% contraction in supply chain velocity? Or how does this structural allocation model insulate our primary margin from regional inflation? By framing your opposition as a neutral, scientific inquiry, you bypass their defensive ego entirely, forcing their nervous system to abandon its hostile configuration and shift into a submissive analytical mode that focuses exclusively on solving the parameters you have dictated. Furthermore, we must dissect the supreme law of the post-question vacuum and the weaponization of interpretive silence. The fragile retail mind is so terrified of conversational tension that when they ask a high-stakes question, they immediately ruin its psychological weight by continuing to speak, offering multiple choice answers, or softening the blow with phrases like, "I'm just asking because I want to make sure we are aligned." This immediate over-explanation is a catastrophic behavioral leak that signals deep internal anxiety and allows the counterparty to easily escape the hook of the inquiry. The sovereign practices the art of absolute
Investigative immobility. The exact millisecond your diagnostic question crosses your lips, you completely freeze your vocal mainframe and introduce a heavy, unmoving silence. You lock your gaze onto their upper facial triangle with a clinical, unblinking focus, refusing to offer a reassuring head nod or an encouraging smile. You leave the raw question hanging in the dead space of the boardroom like an unexploded ordnance. Under the intense gravity of this silent vacuum, the counterparty cannot use vague corporate buzzwords to dodge the issue. They are forced to confront the actual structural limitations of their plan, experiencing immediate cognitive overload as they try to formulate an answer under your silent, unyielding scrutiny. This investigative containment prepares you for the clinical execution of the semantic entrapment and self-liquidation loop. Because the opponent is frantically speaking to fill the heavy silence you have manufactured, their internal filters will rapidly degrade under the stress of the interaction, driving them to commit critical, unforced verbal errors. They will over-explain their points, volunteer hidden operational data, and systematically expose the weaknesses of their own positions. The sovereign does not interrupt this self-destructive transmission. You absorb their words with absolute stone-cold stillness, acknowledging their statements with nothing more than a slow, neutral nod that signals you are logging the data into your system. When they finish speaking and look to you for immediate feedback, you introduce another 3-second pause, allowing their own contradictions to hang in the air until the emotional static completely evaporates. You then deliver a short, definitive executive directive that gracefully integrates their unforced admissions into your master frame, using phrases like, "Since you have acknowledged the structural volatility of this timeline, we will now implement our insulated protocol." You have successfully neutralized their opposition and rewritten the strategy of the enterprise without ever needing to argue, shout, or raise your vocal volume. By integrating these advanced magnetic inquiry subroutines within the fourth layer of your invisible influence blueprint, you have elevated your communication from a blunt instrument of verbal coercion to an elite, hyper-efficient system of psychological architecture. You no longer enter boardroom negotiations hoping to convince others through the volume of your rhetoric. You command the hidden parameters of the interaction, using silence, diagnostic questions, and focused non-reactivity to build a heavy gravitational field that automatically reroutes the consciousness of the room to match your strategic desires. The old software of retail verbal desperation, argumentative hyperactivity, and submissive over-explanation has been permanently purged from your operational system, leaving you standing at the absolute center of your professional matrix as an unyielding, unhackable master of silent legislative authority and invisible network command. To advance into the fifth layer of silent authority, you must master the structural engineering of an impenetrable internal psychological firewall and the absolute regulation of your neurochemical baseline under chronic operational pressure. The average business executive or corporate leader moves through the professional landscape with a highly porous nervous system that is completely exposed to external emotional contagion. When a sudden organizational crisis manifests, whether it is a catastrophic supply chain interruption, a hostile corporate boardroom coup, or the unexpected defection of a premium partner, the unvetted individual experiences an immediate, automated surge of survival cortisol and adrenaline. Their physical vessel enters a frantic fight-or-flight configuration, characterized by rapid thoracic breathing, kinetic micro-tremors, and an erratic vocal pitch that completely betrays their internal panic to the mirror neurons of their competitors. This physiological collapse is a fatal operational failure. It instantly castrates your authority, signals to the environment that your system has been successfully disrupted, and invites your rivals to launch immediate, high-velocity counterplays to dismantle your remaining market share. The sovereign alchemist completely rejects this state of biological vulnerability, treating intense professional pressure not as an emotional crisis, but as a neutral data processing event that requires absolute physiological deceleration. This chemical containment requires the immediate implementation of the somatic deceleration and diaphragmatic anchoring protocol. The exact millisecond an unexpected anomaly or a hostile psychological attack breaches your physical perimeter, you do not launch an immediate verbal reply or allow your facial matrix to display your internal calculations. You execute a clean, clinical system reboot. You consciously slow your respiration cycle down to a heavy, rhythmic cadence of 5 seconds on the inhale and 5 seconds on the exhale, anchoring your breath deep within your pelvic floor to permanently suppress the thoracic survival reflex. You relax your jaw muscles, eliminate the protective muscle tension in your upper trapezius grid, and maintain your physical vessel in a state of absolute, unmoving geometric stillness. By intentionally freezing your somatic velocity while the environment enters a state of high-octane panic, you force your internal server to bypass the primitive emotional filters of your limbic system, allowing your prefrontal cortex to analyze the incoming variables with the cold, clinical precision of an elite military auditor, ensuring that your external demeanor remains completely unshockable. Furthermore, we must dissect the supreme law of energetic non-reactivity and the weaponization of the unreadable facial matrix. The fragile retail mind is deeply addicted to external validation, continuously flashing submissive micro-expressions, such as forced political smiles, nervous eyebrow raises, and rapid blinking patterns.
In a desperate attempt to placate their critics and smooth over interpersonal friction within the office environment, the predatory operator treats their face as an elite cryptographic firewall that completely blocks the transmission of internal data. When a rival actor delivers a highly provocative statement or attempts to apply immediate psychological leverage during a meeting, you look at them through a completely flat, neutral ocular lens. You do not scowl, you do not nod, and you completely refuse to grant them the emotional feedback their nervous system is frantically searching for to validate the effectiveness of their attack. Your absolute non-responsiveness creates an intense psychological vacuum that reverses the direction of the pressure, forcing the aggressor to experience immediate cognitive disorientation as their hostile energy encounters an unyielding, silent stone wall, driving them to break their own focus and commit catastrophic strategic blunders. This internal insulation prepares you for the clinical execution of the emotional isolation boundary. True silent authority is never sustained by internalizing the toxic stress of the corporate matrix and attempting to suppress it through sheer, fragile willpower. It is built upon the total systematic decoupling of your identity from the external events of the marketplace. You view the boardroom maneuvers, the competitive betrayals, and the volatile operational setbacks not as personal slights to your worth, but as fluid macroeconomic variables shifting across a digital board game. When an enterprise architecture collapses or a long-term contract is unilaterally terminated, you do not activate the internal inquisitor or descend into self-punishment. You approach the structural flaw as a detached master engineer protecting a highly valuable instrument. You gather the new data points silently, update your strategic algorithms, and pivot back to the line of execution with absolute, unhurried velocity and complete emotional grace, keeping your core baseline completely intact and your sovereign frame permanently locked onto the trajectory of ultimate institutional command. By integrating these advanced biochemical regulation subroutines within the fifth layer of your invisible influence blueprint, you have achieved a state of absolute internal invulnerability within the professional arena. You are no longer a porous, reactive organism that can be easily manipulated, destabilized, or controlled by the emotional waves of your peers and competitors. You have transformed your nervous system into an unyielding, self-regulating citadel that remains perfectly still in the epicenter of the storm. The old software of internal emotional panic, kinetic micro-tremors, and submissive facial validation has been permanently purged from your operational system, leaving you standing at the absolute center of your reality as an unlit, unhackable master of silent legislative authority, sovereign frame containment, and absolute behavioral dominance.
To advance into the sixth layer of silent authority, you must master the sophisticated dynamics of strategic absenteeism and the tactical weaponization of deliberate operational scarcity within the institutional landscape. The average professional or mid-level corporate manager operates under the frantic, submissive delusion that to secure their position, maximize their influence, and climb the ranks of power, they must remain continuously visible, hyper-available, and perpetually present within every single organizational loop. They attend every low-leverage voluntary meeting, reply to internal digital communication strands within milliseconds, and keep their office doors wide open, foolishly believing that this continuous physical and digital exposure communicates high-value utility to their superiors and peers. This hyper-availability is a critical systemic failure that triggers immediate psychological devaluation within your professional network. In the unyielding physics of human behavior, that which is universally accessible, easily predicted, and constantly on display is instinctively treated by the collective matrix as low-status commodity infrastructure. The sovereign treats their presence as a high-density premium asset that must be rigorously budgeted, strictly pocketed, and strategically withheld to enforce supreme authority. This calculated scarcity requires the immediate implementation of the radical communication exclusion and delayed response protocol. The unvetted operator destroys their professional gravity by being a porous receptor for everyone else's immediate tactical emergencies, constantly derailing their personal concentration server to provide immediate answers to lower-tier executives. The sovereign permanently reconstructs their availability parameters. You do not check your corporate communication portals every 5 minutes. You establish strict, highly clinical attention pockets throughout the operational day, checking your messages exclusively at designated intervals. When an urgent inquiry or a non-critical request lands in your inbox from a rival or a standard peer, you do not reply instantly to maintain social politeness. You intentionally introduce a heavy, calculated processing delay of several hours or even a full business day. By commanding the velocity of your responsiveness, you
silently communicate to the institutional network that your conscious mind is completely occupied with high-altitude strategic execution that sits far above their peripheral tactical noise, automatically forcing them to elevate their own internal processing speed and approach your perimeter with a heavy degree of respect and preparation. Furthermore, we must dissect the supreme law of calculated withdrawal from the non-essential collaborative theater. The fragile retail mind is deeply terrified of experiencing social exclusion or missing an informal corporate alignment session, driving them to volunteer for bloated cross-departmental committees and stay late at corporate social gatherings just to feel integrated into the matrix. The predatory
Operator understands that true magnetic influence is generated not by being part of the noise, but by being the hidden axis that the noise is forced to rotate around. You systematically audit your weekly calendar with absolute analytical detachment, pruning away every meeting, workshop, and committee gathering where your direct legislative signature is not explicitly required to unlock premium capital. When you decline an invitation to an overpopulated corporate session, you do not deliver a high-pitched defensive apology or offer a long-winded justification to appease the organizer. You issue a minimalist, downward-inflected declaration via your executive assistant, stating simply that your current strategic distribution parameters do not allow for allocation to this specific task force. This cold, elegant withdrawal creates an immediate psychological vacuum among the leadership team, transforming your rare, high-leverage appearances into intense institutional events where every word you speak is parsed with absolute gravity. This tactical mastery prepares you for the clinical execution of the strategic departure matrix during active negotiations. In high-stakes corporate standoffs or partner distributions, when the counterparties attempt to stall the transaction timeline, apply artificial bureaucratic friction, or demand unfair structural concessions from your network, the amateur operator stays in the room for hours, burning valuable cognitive equity trying to reason with the unvetted actors. The sovereign operates through the supreme law of absolute walkaway capacity. The exact millisecond the other side crosses your pre-calculated baseline or attempts to deploy low-level manipulation tactics, you do not raise your vocal volume or enter a heated argument. You simply cease all text execution, close your executive notebook with a single controlled physical movement, and stand up from the table in absolute stone-cold silence. You deliver a short, definitive closing parameter with an unblinking gaze, stating calmly, "Since our foundational metrics do not align, this transaction is concluded," before walking out of the room with an unhurried, heavy velocity. This radical, clean severing of the interactive thread instantly shatters the counterparty's ego firewall, plunging their system into a state of acute loss aversion panic that forces them to chase your perimeter, discard their artificial demands, and submissively return to the table, begging to sign the contract on your absolute terms. By integrating these advanced strategic scarcity subroutines within the sixth layer of your invisible influence blueprint, you have permanently emancipated your professional vessel from the exhausting treadmill of hypervisibility. You have transformed your presence into a premium, high-leverage institutional currency that commands immediate authority, precisely because it cannot be easily reached, predicted, or manipulated by the surrounding network. The old software of retail visibility desperation, rapid digital compliance, and submissive over-availability has been permanently liquidated from your operational servers, leaving you standing at the absolute center of your regional theater as a quiet, unhackable master of silent legislative control, sovereign network architecture, and invisible systemic dominance. To advance into the seventh layer of silent authority, you must master the sophisticated mechanics of static psychological steering and the tactical art of transforming the verbal outputs of your peers and competitors into the direct fuel that reinforces your personal institutional command. The average corporate communicator believes that to lead a group or dominate a multi-departmental alignment session, they must act as the primary structural narrator, continuously intervening in every debate, correcting every minor factual error, and shouting down opposing viewpoints to ensure their vision remains dominant. This high-energy interventionist strategy is a catastrophic operational blunder that quickly drains your internal neurological processing reserves and exposes your strategic hand to your rivals. When you continuously intervene, you lower your operational scale, transforming your vessel from a pristine legislative authority into a messy participant in a chaotic sandbox brawl. The sovereign completely rejects this reactive operational methodology. You understand that true unlit influence is generated by assuming the posture of the structural containment vessel, the silent, heavy axis that allows the surrounding network to exhaust their emotional and verbal capital before stepping into the vacuum to deliver a minimalist, definitive directive that instantly reshapes the gravity of the enterprise. This static steering requires the immediate implementation of the passive exhaustion and behavioral mirroring extraction protocol. When you enter a high-stakes corporate assembly where complex strategic directives are being actively contested, you do not launch an immediate offensive to establish your presence. You settle your physical vessel into a state of absolute, unmoving geometric stillness and allow your rivals to speak first, actively encouraging them through your silent, focused attention to project their arguments, lay bare their internal corporate fears, and burn their premium cognitive equity. As they argue among themselves, frantically trying to outshout one another to impress the senior stakeholders, their emotional filters will rapidly degrade, causing them to commit critical, unforced structural errors and volunteer highly sensitive balance sheet data that they had originally planned to protect. The sovereign acts as a cold, analytical recording server, logging their contradictions, mapping their defensive boundaries, and isolating their hidden operational anxieties without moving a single facial muscle. By letting your competitors exhaust their verbal ammunition while your internal system remains completely rested and fully insulated, you maintain an absolute informational and energetic advantage that guarantees an unassailable tactical triumph the moment you choose to break your silence. Furthermore, we must dissect the supreme law of the definitive structural synthesis and the elimination of conversational debate. When the chaotic verbal noise of the room finally hits a point of natural exhaustion, and the participants turn their eyes toward your perimeter in a state of cognitive fatigue, searching for direction, you do not enter a long descriptive argument to defend your vision. You deliver a short, concentrated, and intensely focused legislative synthesis that gracefully integrates their unforced admissions into your pre-calculated master frame. You use precise, downward-inflected phrases like, "Since the operational data presented by engineering confirms our resource bottleneck and the financial limits outlined by logistics restrict our timeline, we will now execute our insulated protocol." You state this conclusion not as a proposal to be debated, but as a finalized administrative reality that has already been codified into the universe. If a lower status actor attempts to reopen the debate or challenge your synthesis with high-frequency rhetorical noise, you do not raise your voice to counter their claim. You simply lock your eyes onto their facial matrix with a flat, clinical gaze, allowing a freezing 3-second pause to hang over the table until their nervous system submissively retreats from the conflict, cementing your authority as an unyielding law of physics. This behavioral command prepares you for the clinical execution of the silent credit acquisition and blame reallocation matrix. In the intense theater of corporate evolution, when a high-stakes strategic project achieves an explosive milestone or a massive capital win, the unvetted individual frantically rushes to the public square, loudly broadcasting their contributions and fighting with their colleagues to claim a sliver of institutional recognition.
This desperate scramble for applause is a profound behavioral leak that betrays deep-seated professional insecurity and alienates senior decision-makers. The sovereign operates through the law of absolute quiet credit gravitational pull. You do not shout about your achievements. You allow your structural systems, your automated digital platforms, and your highly disciplined direct reports to deliver the clean, clinical results directly to the executive board. Because your name is anchored to the underlying infrastructure that made the victory possible, the senior leadership will instinctively credit your silent stewardship with the success of the enterprise, transforming your quiet posture into a massive magnetic field that pulls institutional status directly into your vault, while your hyperactive rivals are left looking like desperate retail entities begging for corporate scraps. By integrating these advanced static steering protocols within the 7th layer of your invisible influence blueprint, you have permanently left behind the exhausting low-level warfare of verbal persuasion. You have transformed your conscious mind into an elite, high-altitude structural containment field that seamlessly commands the energy, the words, and the behavioral flaws of the human network to serve your grand vertical empire. The old software of argumentative hyperactivity, conversational interventionism, and the frantic scramble for social recognition has all been permanently purged from your operational system, leaving you standing at the absolute center of your industrial matrix as an unlit, unhackable master of silent legislative authority, sovereign frame containment, and absolute behavioral dominance. To advance into the 8th layer of silent authority, you must master the architecture of remote psychological containment and the tactical execution of invisible institutional guidance through written administrative directives, unyielding corporate bylaws, and self-regulating execution protocols. The average corporate manager or organizational leader operates under the profound behavioral delusion that to maintain operational alignment, enforce compliance, and direct their human infrastructure at scale, they must be physically omnipresent, continuously broadcasting verbal micromanagement cues and staging exhausting weekly performance reviews to keep their direct reports under surveillance. This frantic, high-frequency physical intervention is a critical systemic failure that destroys your authority. It keeps your conscious mind permanently trapped within low-leverage tactical brushfires, suffocates the professional autonomy of your team, and signals to the enterprise that your system lacks the structural strength to function without constant manual maintenance. The sovereign completely rejects this brute force methodology. You understand that the highest, most absolute form of authority is entirely non-physical and completely silent. You do not manage people through the erratic vibration of your vocal cords. You design a flawless, unlit regulatory matrix, a collection of written legislative blueprints that silently and ruthlessly channels the energy, the focus, and the performance vectors of your entire organization toward your grand strategic objectives, without you ever needing to speak a single word. This remote containment requires the immediate implementation of the algorithmic operational protocol and the removal of verbal oversight. The unvetted individual attempts to correct employee performance errors by scheduling uncomfortable, high-energy verbal confrontations, which instantly triggers immediate defensive resentment and emotional friction within the subordinate's nervous system. The sovereign completely bypasses this emotional theater. You build a self-regulating corporate ecosystem where every operational workflow, every quality benchmark, and every escalation pathway is written down with the surgical precision of software code. When an objective target is missed or an administrative failure occurs, you do not launch an angry speech. You allow the automated protocol to execute its pre-calculated disciplinary subroutines. The corporate system itself issues the objective metric penalty, reroutes the project ownership to a more efficient node, and flags the underperforming asset for automatic review. Because the corrective action is executed by a cold, neutral legal framework rather than a reactive human voice, the employee cannot find a personal ego to attack or argue with. They are forced to
submissively accept the structural reality of the protocol, correcting their behavior to fit within your unyielding legislative matrix, while your internal processing bandwidth remains completely undisturbed. Furthermore, we must dissect the supreme law of semantic weight and the clinical mastery of the written executive directive. When you choose to break your remote silence and transmit an administrative instruction, you completely eliminate the polite conversational filler, the emojis, and the collaborative validation phrases that the collective uses in their digital communications to plead for popularity within the office Slack channels. You deliver your digital inputs with absolute textual compression and clinical neutrality, stripping your sentences of all exclamation points or emotional modifiers. You use clear, minimalist, and absolute written commands, like assemble the comprehensive supply chain audit by Friday noon, or terminate our engagement with the third-party logistics provider immediately due to resource variance. When you drop these compressed directives onto the enterprise network, you do not request a confirmation of receipt or ask for feedback. You close the transmission thread and remain completely silent. This radical, cold clarity forces the receiving end to read your words multiple times, parsing every single syllable with absolute gravity to ensure zero misalignment, transforming your minimalist text into a heavy, command-oriented artifact that commands absolute execution velocity. This administrative mastery prepares you for the clinical execution of the shadow architecture and the unlit veto infrastructure. True silent authority is reached when your human network behaves exactly as you desire, not because they see you watching them, but because they are hyper-aware that your silent institutional gaze is embedded within the very regulations that dictate their career progression and compensation frameworks. You work quietly through your executive committees, your legal advisors, and your specialized trust structures to write the underlying bylaws, equity vesting schedules, and non-compete covenants that govern the enterprise. You build invisible, automatic trigger mechanisms into the corporate shell. If a rival group attempts to launch a hostile boardroom takeover or alter the strategic direction of the company, your written defensive clauses automatically activate, locking down their voting privileges, diluting their equity shares to zero, and freezing their access to the corporate treasury. You have successfully engineered an unlit, unhackable legal fortress that completely castrates the offensive capabilities of your competitors, protecting your sovereign authority across the multi-generational horizon while you sit in absolute physical isolation, completely insulated from the low-level chaos of the corporate battlefield. By integrating these advanced remote containment subroutines within the 8th layer of your invisible influence blueprint, you have permanently left behind the exhausting, low-level warfare of manual micromanagement. You have transformed your conscious mind into an elite, high-altitude legislative engine that designs the underlying code of the organizational universe, forcing the entire network to submissively self-regulate and compound your power without ever requiring your physical presence or your vocal input. The old software of continuous physical surveillance, verbal micromanagement, and submissive digital overavailability has been permanently liquidated from your operational servers, leaving you standing at the absolute center of your regional theater as a quiet, unhackable master of absolute structural sovereignty, invisible network control, and eternal institutional dominance. To advance into the 9th and ultimate layer of silent authority, you must transition your focus from individual organizational plays to the permanent synthesis of your sovereign presence and the absolute institutionalization of your unhackable frame across the multi-generational horizon. True psychological authority is never a temporary performance or a superficial social mask validated exclusively by winning a single boardroom debate, executing a one-off strategic confrontation, or successfully walking away from a volatile negotiation table. The professional arena is a highly dynamic, shifting landscape filled with hidden transactional undercurrents that will ruthlessly dismantle any operator who falls into a state of premature celebration, intellectual stagnation, or behavioral complacency following their initial triumphs. The average individual matches their professional expansion with an immediate, submissive escalation in their outward validation-seeking behaviors, frantically boasting about their organizational status within public networks and broadcasting their newly found leverage to seek admiration from their peers. This operational negligence is a profound behavioral trap that quickly leaks their strategic data, re-exposes their perimeter to competitive exploitation, and drags their nervous system right back into a state of functional vulnerability. The sovereign operator treats initial authority as nothing more than raw infrastructure. You do not celebrate your psychological victories, you instantly channel your personal leverage into automated institutional frameworks, written structural protocols, and private operational boundaries that command compliance independent of your physical presence, ensuring that your silent authority remains permanently unlit and unhackable for decades to come. This final integration requires the clinical execution of the infinite frame compounding loop and systemic psychological immunization to maintain an unassailable position of nonverbal dominance across changing institutional environments. Your entire behavioral ecosystem must be structured as a heavy gravitational mass that continuously feeds on external environmental friction. You do not rely on traditional retail leadership advice or public management seminars to dictate your personal communication frequency. You design a private, closed-loop behavioral network where the quiet authority generated by your spatial mastery, conversational gap engineering, and strategic scarcity is instantly rerouted through your organizational protocols to capture more territorial assets and neutralize rising competitors before they can gather momentum. You establish clear, non-negotiable chemical boundaries. No external corporate crisis or hostile interpersonal anomaly is ever allowed to disrupt your inner neurochemical equilibrium or accelerate your somatic velocity. By distributing your conscious attention exclusively across high-altitude strategic variables and unhackable cash flow infrastructure, you ensure that even if an entire market sector experiences massive disruption or an aggressive internal coalition attempts to destabilize your corporate division, your overarching sovereign framework remains completely unaffected, continuing to command the institutional matrix in absolute silence and freedom. Furthermore, we must restructure the mechanics of strategic heritage and the absolute transmission of the sovereign code to your successors. The ultimate vulnerability of an elite, silent leader is not found within the volatile maneuvers of corporate rivals or the aggressive regulations of external authorities. It is found within the natural biological decline of their personal vessel and the potential behavioral dilution of their lineage. If you construct an impenetrable fortress of silent authority, but fail to install your cold, analytical mindset into the psychology of your chosen heirs, your life's work will be completely liquidated and absorbed back into the chaotic matrix by reactive, hyperverbal successors within a single generation. The sovereign treats organizational succession with the exact same hyper-focused discipline used to dismantle their competitors. You do not hand over raw institutional status or unearned strategic leverage to your descendants, which only breeds submissive entitlement and operational blindness.
You force them to enter the professional wilderness early, training their internal radar to spot structural fault lines, manage toxic behavioral contagion under intense social stress, and command high-stakes assemblies through absolute economy of movement. You embed your strategic principles into binding operational guidelines and trust charters, ensuring that executive power is unlocked exclusively when your successors hit non-negotiable benchmarks of emotional containment, linguistic compression, and silent legislative execution, permanently preserving your imperial framework across the generational horizon. Stand firmly at the absolute apex of your newly engineered behavioral matrix and observe the global professional landscape with the cool, calculating detachment of an elite military auditor. Look back through the historical timelines of your consciousness and observe the old, unvetted version of your vessel, the porous, reactive entity that lived in constant social anxiety, frantically over-explaining its worth, raising its vocal volume to beg for attention, and submissively waiting for the collective matrix to reward its compliance, and realize that that entity has been
Permanently liquidated from reality. Their fragile programming has been completely wiped from your internal servers, leaving zero residue over your current trajectory. You have stepped across the threshold into the inner sanctum of absolute psychological freedom as the undisputed legislator, judge, and executor of your corporate destiny. Your frame is impenetrable, your physical posture is heavily anchored, your communication is compressed, and your personal velocity commands the exact frequency of every interaction you engage in. You no longer walk through the marketplace begging for entry, looking for consensus, or asking permission to execute your vision. You are the primary cause, the unlit architect, the quiet financial predator who dictates the permanent gravity of the room. Carry this magnificent, unyielding frequency into every executive boardroom you command, every sovereign asset you acquire, every contract you seal, and every moment of profound, quiet solitude. Welcome the shifting organizational cycles with a cold, knowing interior smile. You have successfully rewritten your internal code, fortified your international citadel, and constructed a self-sustaining empire of disciplined order and absolute silent authority. The transformation is finished, the multi-generational legacy is permanently locked, and your absolute freedom is an unalterable law of global physics. Go forth and rule your capital with absolute power, absolute clarity, and absolute peace. The vault is now permanently sealed, and the throne is yours for eternity. To fully operationalize the architecture of silent authority and anchor the law of the strongest within your daily theater of execution, you must treat the following operational directives not as casual interpersonal suggestions, but as non-negotiable legislative mandates for your nervous system. First, you must implement the immediate audit of your daily verbal expenditure, tracking every sentence that leaves your lips with the cold detachment of a financial accountant. Every time you speak without a calculated strategic objective, you are volunteering premium energy and revealing your internal data to potential competitors. Force your system to speak less than necessary, compressing your insights into minimalist, high-impact declarations that leave an intentional informational vacuum around your perimeter. Second, you must eliminate the submissive physical gestures of social validation that the collective matrix uses to plead for acceptance within the workspace. Cease the hyperactive head nodding, freeze your facial microexpressions, and expand your geometric posture to occupy your full physical territory with unhurried, heavy velocity. When a hostile actor attempts to disrupt your baseline with conversational static or emotional microaggressions, respond with absolute kinetic stillness and an unblinking analytical gaze that reflects their anxiety back into their own system. Third, master the weaponization of the conversational delay by introducing a deliberate pause of 4 to 6 seconds before replying to any high-stakes inquiry or aggressive ultimatum.
This calculated processing latency shatters the pre-rehearsed
scripts of your opponents, forcing their limbic servers into acute self-doubt and driving them to volunteer critical, unforced compromises before you have even committed to a position. Fourth, secure your professional presence through the calculated implementation of operational scarcity. Step out of the low-leverage collaborative noise, decline non-essential task forces without delivering high-pitched defensive apologies, and strictly partition your digital communication responsiveness. By making your presence a rare, premium institutional currency, you automatically force the surrounding network to approach your gate with a profound degree of preparation and respect. Finally, you must completely decouple your core identity from the volatile dynamics of the corporate battlefield, viewing organizational crises, competitive betrayals, and operational bottlenecks not as personal slights, but as raw data variables shifting across an international matrix. Maintain your internal neurochemical baseline in a state of absolute, deep-seated stabilization through diaphragmatic anchoring, keeping your prefrontal cortex fully optimized to execute high-value interventions while the herd descends into panic. By integrating these cold executive protocols into your foundational operating system, you permanently close your borders to external manipulation, transforming your physical vessel into an unyielding, sovereign citadel of silent command and invisible network dominance.